Hi, my name is Eduardo Ortiz, and you are listening to University of Chicago Public Policy Podcast.
Hey, good afternoon, evening, or good morning, depending on when you're listening. I'm your co-host, Kurt Nugent.
I'm James Johnson.
And my name is Rei Bertoldi, and you're listening to Kinda Sorta Brown, a University of Chicago public policy podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about the ways in which identity informs experiences within academic settings. Our conversations are going to grapple with the ways in which interactions of race and sexuality manifest themselves on university campuses. We're joined today by Payton Head, an MA student here at the Harris School. On campus, he serves as a Director of Communications for Black Action and Public Policy Studies and as a Program Coordinator for the inaugural Obama Foundation Scholars. After his experiences leading the student body during racial unrest at the University of Missouri in 2015, he empowers student leaders to use their platforms to engage campus communities on issues related to the intersection of race, sexual orientation, and other identities. We're also joined today by Terri Smith, a second-year political science PhD student and intern at the Office for Diversity and Inclusion Enrollment Initiatives here at the University of Chicago. She studies Black action policies, specifically queer Black studies, social movements, and Black feminism. Currently, she's working on her thesis, which discusses Black queer feminism as political praxis within movement for Black lives.
Thank you for joining us today, guys. Just to kind of get the ball rolling here and to explain a little bit to our audiences about who you are, how do you each identify yourselves?
Well, first, thank you for having me. I identify as a Black queer woman.
And I identify as a Black queer man.
All right, so taking that in consideration, my follow-up question for you guys would be, when did you first start to grapple with your own intersectional identity?
For me, I think during my undergrad careers when I really started to understand it. I went to a PWI, a very conservative PWI in the South. And I think then I hadn't even really come to terms with my identity myself or really fully understood it. And I think from just being in environments that were pretty toxic, to say the least, and sort of hearing what people thought about others that were different from them, I think sort of their negativity is actually what made me be more proud about my identity. And it made me be more vocal against it. And it made me start to join different organizations that were actively battling this type of thing. And I think through that work is when I really started to understand and embrace my own identity.
So my experience is really similar to Terri's. I think for me, I started to grapple with my identity my freshman year of college. I was away and I was more aware than I had ever been before of not only my sexual orientation, but also my just race in general. So I'm from this area, the south suburbs and the south side of Chicago, and all of these areas are predominantly Black. And when I went to the middle of Missouri for school, it was the first time where I really, really saw myself as being other, being a minority, and not even thinking about what does that mean to add in a minority sexual identity as well. So it was organizations on campus like Queer People of Color that really, really, really got me to be proud about who I was and also learn the history of it. We didn't just have these meetings where we would just talk about things that didn't matter. We would have meetings where we would set aside time to learn the history of people like Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera and all these incredible heroes that a lot of times we don't necessarily hear about in our history books. So that was a time for me, my freshman, sophomore, junior year of incredible development where I started to become proud of who I was and all of my identities. And it really, really got me excited about student leadership. The spaces that I looked to on campus that I thought would be the places of inclusion weren't necessarily the places that would be for me. The LGBTQ Center I found to be very isolating in many ways because it was very white and a lot of the students there didn't see. This was back in 2013. So intersectionality wasn't as big of a conversation, a standard conversation as it is now in academia and outside of academia today. And so all of these different identities that I started to come into terms with was a result of having incredible people around me who were just fearless in every sense of the word. And I still look to them today for leadership. So I think mentorship is important, and I hope that I can continue to do that for other people.
And so you kind of just touched on that. I also wanted to ask you, Terri, what communities were you able to find that kind of helped you in discovering yourself in your own identity?
Mm-hmm. I think organizations that really helped me come into it are Chicago-based, because when I really started to grapple with it during undergrad, I was in more so activist organizations. They weren't very focused on specific identities. But I think coming here and joining BYP 100, which is a Black youth organization that uses a Black queer feminist lens, was really helpful, being with people that look like me, think like me, and that are all fighting that same struggle. And then just meeting people through there and joining sort of other organizations that are very related get to, and then finding that group of people like on campus and in nearby communities, and just sort of have like a group of people that, you know, we all understand what we're going through.
I think this is important for our listeners. Can you talk more about BYP 100?
Yeah, so like I said, it's a Black youth activist organization. And I think one of the most unique things about it is that it's not just a group of people who are interested in activist work, but it's an organization that teaches you how to organize. And so there are a lot of strategy sessions and community building and learning how to make connections with people in other cities. So there are several chapters across the nation. And as I mentioned before, they organize through a Black queer feminist lens. So the goal is to tackle issues that impact those who are most marginalized, and to do so in a way that centers those people. And the idea is that there are Black people in every marginalized group. So if you focus on the Black person, you can then liberate all marginalized groups.
That's actually, I think, a pretty good transition into our next question, specifically talking about the lens of privilege that's afforded to a lot of us here at a place like the University of Chicago. How do you guys find that you guys are very involved with community work, both inside and outside of Chicago, whether it's with student leaders or with training groups for the next generation of advocates and transformational leaders? How do you guys deal with the fact that there's inherently a lot of privilege that comes from being at the University of Chicago, while also dealing with the fact that you're at the same time sometimes actively being othered or experiencing a lot of barriers that your peers here aren't facing?
Yeah, this is something that I think I've only recently started to understand, because I think with being an underrepresented minority at an institution like this, when you talk about it to other people, they like to talk about, well, you have the opportunity to be there, and you're lucky to be there, and you're lucky to be able to do this and that and the other, which you are. And I think I sort of fell into that pattern too, of just talking about how lucky we are. But I recently went to a book talk, and this conversation actually came up, and it was just that, like, we are in a very interesting position in that, like, yes, we're lucky to be here, but in being here, we also are in very violent environments. And I think I haven't really figured out how to grapple with that necessarily, but I think the most important part is that I've understood that, yes, I'm lucky to be here, but I also have to understand that being here is difficult, and that, you know, my experience and my journey here is going to look a lot different than somebody else's might.
So that's a really great question. I grapple with this every single day that I come to campus. Something that I kind of allude to oftentimes when I talk about the University of Chicago is its own history, just being right here, and my own history, like, as it relates to the institution. So I talk about how my grandfather was one of the construction workers for this school, and the time he was doing that, he would have never thought that not only would he be able to get into a school like this, but that his descendants would either, because of just how structurally violent this place has been for so long. And so that conversation even resonated with me and my father, who just turned 80 years old last year.
Happy birthday.
I know, right? So his perspective is everything. It honestly grounds me in my being, because I think that when you know who and whose you are, you can't be BS'd on where you have the potential to go in the future, right? And so I think that's one of the biggest privileges that I have, is just having somebody who has lived through all of this, who has been around since 1938, who can tell you, like, look, this happened before. Everything that you're seeing is just a repeat. You all just have social media right now and all this stuff to, like, expose it. So when I think about being here, I think about not only the incredible privilege it is to be here, but also just the burden of the responsibility that comes from making sure that these resources don't just stay here. And that was one of the reasons why I chose here. A lot of Black students who get into this university have the option to go anywhere else many times and get money for it too, because we don't really do that whole money thing very well. But I knew for me that I wanted to be here. I wanted to be on Chicago's South Side. I'm just, 10 minutes away from my mom, about 15 minutes away from my dad. My auntie is about 15 minutes away too. So, like, all my family is in a radius of this institution, and it has so much power and so much influence, but also so much access to knowledge. And with knowledge comes opportunity. With opportunity comes resources. And so I came here because I love the idea that I could pick up my niece and nephew one day and bring them to Harris Public Policy, and they could study with Black Action and Public Policy students, where I could bring in my, 7-year-old niece, and she could work with Black PhD students on some of the problems that she was dealing with in her math class. And I know that that meant something to them. And they ask me all the time, like, Uncle Payton, when can we go back to Uchicago? It's so bougie. We love hanging out there, and we love getting to know the people around them. And I think that there's a missed opportunity here when you think about just the talent that comes into this institution that isn't necessarily always shared with the city in a responsible way, in addition to the opportunity that exists for people who come here, who are so wonderful, who are so amazing in so many different ways, to engage with the community that has like withstood so much. This city, this part of the city has been such a stronghold for the Black community across the entire diaspora around the world. Black History Month, Negro History Week was invented by Carter G. Woodson, and that happened right here at Uchicago. So the way that we celebrate Blackness and Black identity is all rooted in this area. So I think that it's important for me, like as I think about like the privileges of what it means to be here, to make sure that people also understand that it is a privilege for them to be here, to be in Chicago, to be, you know, in this community that has helped cultivate this institution into what it is today.
Kind of going off of that, I kind of wanted to ask, in what ways do you think that Uchicago can be more inclusive?
That's a big question, huh?
That could be a whole policy recommendation. But I think for starters, just making sure that people aren't misinformed. Because I think the misinformation starts a lot of times when people step foot on campus. When I hear students tell me all the time, oh, well, I've been told not to go south of 63rd Street or not to go east of the Dan Ryan. And I always think, I'm like, wow, that's interesting that people are actually being taught that kind of stuff when they come here, and they miss out on so much that is happening in this community. Because you do that, you're missing out on all of South Shore. You're missing out on all of Auburn Gresham and Chatham and all of these incredible like neighborhoods around us. Or if you're blocking off the west side, like Pilsen and all of these different strongholds for these different communities that have like made Chicago and continue to make this city what it is today. So I think that some things that the university could do to be more inclusive is to just take the time to realize that the perspectives of the people who are here matter so much. And while they may not have 17 degrees behind their name, not everybody does, of course, that their information and their stories should be valued just as much as anybody else's. I think another thing too would be to make sure that people who come here who teach have a background into what this area means, right? Know about the Great Migration. If you're in a public policy school and you don't know about the impacts of the Great Migration and how it created like many of the policies that we deal with today, I don't think that you should be in front of a classroom. I don't think that that's cultivating an environment that prioritizes people from all over the world and their stories. So I think that there's a lot that we need to do. I think that there's a lot of decolonization that has to happen within our curriculum. I think that we have to really, really take a look at what we want our social impact to be out in the world. But that doesn't mean that we're not making efforts and not making strides now.
Thank you, Payton. You're listening to Kinda Sorta Brown with Payton Head and Terri Smith. We'll be right back.
Hey, UC3P listeners. I'm Thomas.
And I'm Nick.
In the United States, public faith in the military remains sky high, while trust in other government institutions sinks to an all-time low.
At the same time, fewer than 1% of Americans will ever serve in the armed forces, and the cultural divide between active duty troops and the civilian population continues to widen.
UC3P presents a new series, Thank You for Your Service, where we take a deep dive into the complex world of civil-military affairs.
We'll address the politicization of the military, defense policy in the news, and the importance of staying informed in a democracy.
Join us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts as we explore how our professional military institution relates to the society it serves.
All right, welcome back. So we're still here with Payton and Terri, and we're going to get into a bit of a more like informal discussion, so feel free to jump in as necessary. But the first question I actually do have is a little bit more directed at Payton. So in case, for those of you that don't know, Payton's our local Instagram celebrity. Our man flies all over the U.S. conducting various speaking engagements. And something I've always wondered is, how do you go about taking those engagements, considering your identity? Like, do you have certain things that you're not willing to speak at? Things like that.
That's a great question. I don't necessarily have engagements that I'm not necessarily willing to speak. I guess because I don't get a lot of them that are just blatantly where I would look at and I would be like, oh no, I'm not going. I think sometimes when I look and I see, and I always ask people like, what is the reasoning behind me coming? Like, what is it that you hope to get out of it? If it's somebody who just wants to have somebody who is there to speak on certain issues, but not get too radical or too political or incite people to act, then I tell them, I'm like, I'm not your guy, because I'm going to speak openly and honestly about not only my experiences, but what, I recommend and what I think that we all should be doing as a generation to bring about change. Does that mean that I'm going to do that? No, not necessarily. But I just find it interesting that sometimes people really, really, especially universities, they really just want to check this off of their box, you know, and just like, hey, like we did diversity, we brought in somebody to speak about oppression or whatever, and now we can move on. And then also I think about it sometimes, I'm like, even if they are just trying to check diversity off of their list, I'm going to give them a message that's more than that checklist, right? So I oftentimes